Hey, it's Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to look at lesson number 3 in Unit 5, and it's the Wilson years. And we're talking about, once again, progressivism. We're going to talk about Wilson's take on progressivism, and we're going to find that Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat that became president in 1912, he's going to take, progressivism and put it on steroids. So he's going to basically shame what Theodore Roosevelt and what William Howard Taft do in terms of looking at progressivism. Today we'll start with looking at the unit focus question as we always do. And what the unit focus question does is it kind of gives us a main idea in terms of what it is that we want you to get from this particular lesson, this unit. How can government fix social problems? We're going to look at our journal topic today. And once again, we tell you that if you have a journal, what you should do, of course, is write down these types of questions in vocabulary that comes up a little bit in a few moments, and write these things down because they can be very valuable resources to you when it comes to taking the MAP assessment. The journal topics is how does the popular vote impact the presidential election, and is it possible to elect a president without winning the popular vote? So we'll give you a couple of moments, have you look over that particular question, and then we'll come back in a few minutes and we will talk about what the possible answers could be. Okay? Well, you should have had enough time that you were able to go through, of course, and look at this particular question. And the first part of the question, it says, how does the popular vote impact the presidential election? Well, you're not elected president of the United States of America because of the number of votes that you get. You can actually, and we've had this happen, of course, with the election of President Donald Trump, and then the election, of course, of George W. Bush here recently. Neither one of them, W. Bush, of course, in the first election did not win the popular vote, of course, and then, of course, Donald Trump, of course, in 2016 did not win the popular vote, but they still became president of the United States of America, because what the popular vote does is it gives you, if you win the popular vote in a particular state, you gain the electors for that particular state, which means this here is very possible, of course, for you to lose the popular vote but still become president because of the electoral college system. And that's one of the things that, if you are progressive, that's one of the things that progressives are would look at and say, well, maybe we need something to change like that. So when you look at progressives, they look at things through a different lens than you and I would look. They look at different things that they believe would make America better. So when we're talking about the progressive movement here, this may be a topic, of course, that they would want to take up. When we look at vocabulary, what we did, of course, is we try to highlight the vocabulary as we go, but if we miss one, make sure that you go back, of course, yourself and do write them down, of course, and you can look up yourself. And as I always say, it's probably even better that you look them up yourself, because you're going to be more inclined, of course, to remember them if you look them up yourself. But we'll try to address them as we go. The lesson focus question is, what caused the breakdown in the political relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, which allowed Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win the election in 1912, and what were Wilson's contributions to progressivism? So these questions, of course, are kind of the main ideas of this particular lesson, and what it gives us an opportunity to do is to kind of go along and see if we can pick up elements that answer these two questions. I will tell you a brief story about the election of 1912. In the election of 1912, Theodore Roosevelt is running. He runs on something called the Bull Moose platform. He doesn't get the Republican nomination. He gets the progressive nomination, and he adopts the moniker of the Bull Moose because when he was giving a speech, he was shot. Actually, he was shot, and even though he was shot during the speech, he finished his speech, shirt, red with blood, and he nicknamed himself the Bull Moose because he was strong as a bull moose, and because when he was shot, he was able to continue and finish his speech. And if you knew anything about the history of Theodore Roosevelt, you know that sounds exactly like something he would do. You notice, of course, we have a picture of Mount Rushmore over here on the right here. Theodore Roosevelt, he's long recognized as one of the greats in terms of looking at American presidential history. William Howard Taft is a Republican candidate in 1912, and Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat. And as I said, Woodrow Wilson, who doesn't receive the majority of the popular vote, wins the election. When you only need 270 electoral votes to win, he wins it with 435, with 42% of the popular vote. The election was primarily decided before the election occurred because when Theodore Roosevelt and Taft couldn't decide who should run and support the Republican Party, the vote was split. And because it was split, there's no way that the Republicans, of course, would have enough votes, of course, that they could defeat the Democratic candidate. The domestic policy of Woodrow Wilson was called New Freedom. And what New Freedom's goals were his progressive goals. He wanted to pass a graduated income tax, check, he did. He reduced tariffs, check, he did. Reform the banking system, check, he did. Strengthen the antitrust legislation with something called the Clayton Antitrust Act, check, he did. Make child labor under age 14 against federal law. So when you look at Woodrow Wilson, we said that he's a progressive president on steroids. He does more to reform America's ills and American government than any other president up until that time. That's not to say that Theodore Roosevelt, of course, and Taft weren't great progressive presidents, they were. But Wilson kind of takes everything, of course, and kind of ramps it up even more. Income taxes. Wilson introduced the 16th Amendment, creating the graduated income tax and cut tariffs. He was the first president to address Congress since John Adams to gain support for the bill. He wanted the income tax to be passed, so what he did is he went before Congress and he basically made a speech to Congress where he addressed Congress and asked them, of course, to take up this bill and pass the bill, and the result, of course, was the creation of the income tax. Wilson's efforts also allowed for both direct and indirect taxes. Direct taxes would be taxes on property. You couldn't, if you own property, direct taxes would be taxes that you would have to pay. The only problem with direct taxes, they have to be proportional for each state. In other words, it had to be based on the size of the state. And in looking at it, those direct taxes, the government in some cases was reluctant, of course, to do those. And then, of course, the creation of indirect taxes. The indirect taxes would be like sales taxes, excise taxes, and the income tax. We're going to find that what Wilson does is create the 16th Amendment. Wilson proposed the creation of the central U.S. bank backed by the federal government to restore trust in American banks. If you remember, we talked about in some prior units how one of the wealthiest men, of course, in the country was Andrew Carnegie, and at one point the government, of course, had to borrow money from Carnegie to bail itself out of a financial situation. Well, one of the things that Wilson planned to do, of course, was to create something called the Federal Reserve. And what the Federal Reserve would require that banks, of course, become members of the Federal Reserve, and they would keep a certain amount of money in reserve in these 13 Federal Reserve banks, so that if hard times did come, they would have that money, of course, in reserve, and that money, of course, could be used, of course, to bail them out. One of the things that happens with the Federal Reserve, though, the Federal Reserve also takes on the responsibility of setting monetary policy, which means it's here. The Federal Reserve can put money in circulation, take money out of circulation. If it put money in circulation, prices go up with inflation. If it takes money out of circulation, prices go down with deflation. So when you look at the creation of the Federal Reserve, it is one of the most significant pieces of legislation that's created by any president in the early part of the 20th century. Wilson agreed with Roosevelt about the value of big businesses and was reluctant to interfere with monopolies, but he did, because he understood that he hated the idea of interfering with businesses because they had to compete with businesses overseas like Roosevelt thought. But he understood that if you didn't regulate businesses in the country, the common man, the public interest, of course, would be rolled over. So he does do more regulation of businesses when it comes to antitrust. He creates the Clayton Antitrust Act, which was passed by Wilson to bolster the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Clayton Act exempted unions and agricultural organizations from government regulation. So if you were a business, you could fall under the reach of the Clayton Antitrust Act. But if you were a farm organization, like the Farmers Alliance or the Grange or something like that, or if you were a union, like the American Federation of Labor or the American Federation or the United Mine Workers, you didn't fall under the jurisdiction of the Clayton Antitrust Act. And because of that, for the first time, it gave unions the right to exist. Wilson was able to get Keating-Owen Child Labor Act of 1916 passed, and what it basically says that it would eliminate child labor before the age of 14. The Supreme Court eventually declares it unconstitutional with anger progressives, but endeared Wilson to progressives. In other words, He tried to get it passed. It didn't necessarily go over the way that he wanted it to because the Supreme Court struck it down. But even him trying to do so, for a lot of people thought it was a good thing, especially middle class people whose children didn't necessarily have to work. Wilson was able to pass the Adams Act, which created an 8-hour workday for railroad workers, and the Federal Farm Loan Act, which gave low interest loans to farmers. So even the farmer, who the federal government had neglected, Wilson steps out and even does something for them. The government, particularly the federal government, would assume a more active role in business regulation and solving society's problems. The Progressive Era brought little relief for African Americans and Americans facing religious discrimination, like particularly the Jews. Progressivism failure led to the creation of the NAACP and Anti-Defamation League, which still exists today. So when you look at progressivism, it does a lot of great things for a lot of people in the United States of America. It doesn't do something for everyone, though. We're going to find that Jews, of course, and African Americans will be left out of the progressive agenda. But for the most part, we're going to find that progressivism was one of those periods in American history that made it better for all Americans, for most Americans. The lesson focus question, we had two questions that went along, of course, with this particular lesson. And what it basically says is what caused the breakdown in the political relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, which allowed Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win the election in 1912. Well, it was all about too much regulation. Too much regulation. And Wilson and Taft also Taft also got Gifford Pinchot, Roosevelt's friend, who was appointed to the U.S. Forestry Service. Taft fired him. And that's one of the things, of course, that kind of caused the relationship between the two, of course, to fall down the most. And because of that, Roosevelt decides to run. The largest reason, says what were the contributions, Wilson's contributions to progressivism? As we said, he's the most celebrated of the progressive presidents because he did things like lower the tariff, created the income tax, created the Federal Reserve, passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, 8-hour workday for rail workers, low interest loans to farmers, and also things like women's suffrage, passage of the women's suffrage, and I believe the passage of the 18th Amendment, of course, that outlawed or gave us prohibition. Here's some practice questions that you may see, of course, when it comes to the MAP test. The Federal Reserve Act least advocated for the creation of which reform measure? A, the regulation of trusts, B, the creation of regional federal banks, C, the federal control of interest rates, D, the control of the amount of money placed in circulation. Well, the one that the Federal Reserve least did would be the regulation of trust. Now, Wilson created the Federal Reserve Act, but it had to do, of course, with creating, those regional banks, of course, where money had to be kept and reserved, and all those other things the Federal Reserve did too. Next question, which groups missed out on the gains with progressivism? Well, we said it the last time that we talked about, there were two groups, of course, that didn't necessarily benefit from progressivism, and that, of course, would be African American Jews, and because of that, the NAACP was created for African Americans, and the Anti-Defamation League, of course, was used or created, of course, to address issues that religious groups would have in America. That ends lesson 3. But once again, remember, as I always say, you don't have to take my word for it because it's your history. It's American history. So do your own research and come up with your own ideas about what it is that's great about this country. Thank you.